I've done the housekeeping, and so I'm going to move on to the introduction and context for this work. Taser's been doing some work on the ethnicity degree awarding gap for a few years now. We're going to then hear presentations from 3 participating universities. Finally, some recommendations and insights from project evaluators before the Q&A. The speakers today that we'll hear from, we're not hearing from all the projects, but we're hearing from 3 of the projects. Our Sally Anders, from the 3 projects, and we'll also be hearing from the Advanced HE Joint Evaluator team. These are the speakers who you'll hear from later from Birmingham City University, and I'll introduce them when their presentations start. We are delighted to be joined by 3 of these, but as I said, there are 3 additional universities who also took part in this project and whose theory of change outputs are available today on our website. Before we start, however, we wanted to take a poll to get a sense of the participants on this call, what their approach to theories of change in the ethnicity degree awarding gap. So hopefully you can see that poll on your screen right now. So the question is, regarding the ethnicity degree awarding gap, do you have theories of change for your activities that aim to tackle the ethnicity degree awarding gap? And you've got one choice, so yes for all the activities that you've got in your university or provider, yes for some of them. If you're not sure, no, but you're hoping to develop them, no, and you don't have plans on developing a theory of change for any activities that aim to tackle the ethnicity degree awarding gap. I will wait just a bit to make sure enough of the participants on the call fill this in so we can get some solid results, and then I'll hand over to our speakers. Okay, I think that's the signal that we've got enough participants responding to that poll, so thank you for that. So I said I'd start with the context. As I've said, Taser has been doing some work on the ethnicity degree awarding gap for some years, and last year we commissioned Staffordshire University to analyze access and participation plans, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with on the call. These are plans that universities provide to the Office for Students to outline what they're doing to tackle equality of opportunity risks. That report interviewed key stakeholders to understand the current landscape of interventions being delivered in higher education to tackle the degree awarding gap. What the report found was that many of the APPs which had targets to reduce the ethnicity awarding gap didn't have or didn't include a theory of change for their proposed interventions. So they had targets, but they didn't explain it through a theory of change how they might evaluate or deliver against those targets. Of those that did, a large proportion were not very well detailed. It was unclear how that intervention would ultimately lead to a reduction in the gap. So consequently, a key recommendation from that report was that providers develop robust theories of change with clearly articulated mechanisms of change, linking the activities that they were undertaking to the desired outcome, i.e. Tackling the ethnicity degree awarding gap. The report also did identify a widespread lack of confidence in evaluating interventions to tackle the degree awarding gap. So we therefore felt that it was important to build on that recommendation and try to act on it to work with higher education providers to produce robust theory of change. Having said that we found limited evidence of robust theories of change, we felt incumbent upon us to try to support the sector further to do that. We wanted to make sure that that better outlined how that interventions that they were taking in different providers were expected to reduce the degree awarding gap. We also wanted to provide examples of how interventions can be evaluated generally and make these outputs available for the sector to use so that they can plan and evaluate their own activities in their context. And hopefully the theories of change that you will see presented today and that are available on our website will support you in your work. So the project design initially involved an open call to select evaluators and 6 HE providers. We actually had quite a lot of interest in this project. Some of, I think the most people expressing an interest in this project of anything that we've done before. I think showing the commitment to this area of work, but also I think the recognition that there needs to be greater support to evaluate the work that's being undertaken so that we are more effectively tackling the ethnicity degree awarding gap. We did also feel it was important because we had so many people interested in working with us to choose a range of different providers, so small and specialist providers as well as larger and diverse institutions and a range of types of institutions as well. And we also recognized, both in the work that we've done previously, but also in the range of people who submitted tenders to work with us, that there are a range of interventions. So we've tried in selecting the 6 partners also to address a range of different kinds of interventions, from whole provider approaches to more focused activities. The staff's Advanced H team then worked collaboratively with the chosen providers to produce 3 outputs: a core theory of change, which provides a high-level snapshot of how an activity is expected to lead to desired outcomes and impact. Then building on that core theory of change, an enhanced theory of change, which instead captures more in-depth information about activities, the why, the what, the who, and mechanisms by which we expect that change to happen. And third, and finally, as you can see on the slide, an evaluation plan. This is something that TASO developed and piloted as part of the project. It's a new template for us. It is designed to be flexible and sit between an enhanced theory of change and a more detailed research or evaluation protocol. The evaluation plan outlines the overall strategy and approach for evaluating an intervention to include the evaluation design and suggest appropriate outcome data. So what kinds of data you might need to collect and what kinds of outcomes those data would be seeking to capture. These outputs, as I've said, are now available to view on the TASO website alongside a summary report, which outlines the key recommendations for developing theories of change and evaluation plans within your own context. And so please do, after this event, look at them and give us any further feedback. I think it is important to note that the evaluation plans are a newish output for us, and that they vary depending on how developed different interventions were at the participating HE providers. For example, newer interventions that have not yet been delivered have a plan for a pilot evaluation. Obviously, if they haven't yet been delivered, we're only able to develop a pilot evaluation with our partners, which enables understanding of how the intervention has been implemented and how it can be rolled out further. So with that caveat in mind, I will summarize the 6 universities who participated in this project with you. I really want to give a huge thanks to all 6 of our participating universities, to the 3 presenters today for taking out the time and for working with us. I also want to thank Staffordshire University Advanced HE team who helped to co-create the various outputs of the project. We weren't able to have all 6 universities present on this event, but we do urge you to look at all of the outputs as there are a range of different interventions covered. And I do just want to give an explicit shout out to all of them. So Birmingham City University, the Accessible Assessment Principles; Loughborough University, the Student Referral Scheme; Manchester Metropolitan University Staff Accountability Partnerships; University of Law Monitoring and Inclusive Learning Panel; University of Southampton's Dissertation Retreats and Awarding Gap Project; and finally, University of York's Departmental Ethnicity Degree Awarding Gap. If you see that in the text, that's what that stands for, framework. And thank you so much again to all of our participating partners. We have learned and continue to learn a huge amount from working with you. So that's enough from me and TASO. I will be now going through the 3 separate partner organizations one by one, and I'll hand over first to Birmingham City University to talk about their intervention as well as their experience in participating in this project. So I believe we'll be hearing first from Dr. Melanie Marie Haywood, and then from Shivani Wilson Rochford.
Thanks, Omar. Hello, everyone. As Omar has introduced, I am Dr. Melanie Marie Haywood, and I'm the Director for our Education Development Service at BCU. And I'm joined by Shivani, who is one of our senior learner developers. And we work together to support the institution around student retention and success. Next slide. Thanks, Omar. Yeah, great. So we just wanted to highlight that these are the key players that we had in ensuring that this project was successful. And I'll talk a little bit more later about senior buy-in. but our Pro Vice Chancellor was extremely supportive. The project actually was initiated by our head of policy and strategy sitting inside one of our evaluation teams at the institution. It was implemented in one of our faculties, through one of our faculty leads, our associate dean. Shivani, who you'll be hearing from later, was key in actually developing the practice around this, and myself as a facilitator. And then our evaluation team, obviously building in that evaluation framework from the beginning through to the end of all of our interventions around our awarding gaps. Next, thank you. So we were part of OFS's Wave 1 for the new access and participation plans. And so we definitely knew that we needed some support in making sure that we were very clear around our approach to access and participation, particularly for student success. We looked at a variety of data, as much data that we could have at the time. And we identified 6 different priority groups amongst our students, of which Black and Asian students stood out. And of which we have a massive gap between Black and white students and Asian and white students in their overall degree awards. So we were grateful to have the opportunity to work with TASO to address our theory of change model and build evaluation in from the start. Based on our internal approach to access and participation, we zeroed in on assessment as one of the key areas that we would focus on. That was largely because we observed that obviously awarding gaps are at program level, but we tried to dissect it to see where did the gaps start to surface. We identified obviously these were module gaps that were surfacing. We identified the modules that these gaps were surfacing on, and that's where we started to see higher volumes of Black and South Asian students. And then we were also able to identify some other key issues around assessment submission, qualities of assessment, first-time submission, which Shivani will talk about a little bit later on. So we wanted to build in a realistic approach to evaluation from the beginning without making assumptions about the students and why the students weren't submitting or why the assessment outcomes were the way that they were. And so we aimed to provide a supportive approach, but also a cross-institutional approach to reducing the gap between Black and South Asian students and white students. Again, looking at a number of data points that we had at the time, we were able to identify that Black and South Asian students at BCU particularly come into the institution with higher volumes of technical vocational qualifications. And so that was a trigger, one of the triggers that we had looking at the data across the institution and looking at interventions. And so we were able to identify the larger cohorts with the majority of the students coming from Black and South Asian backgrounds, looking at where the gaps were surfacing at assessment and so on and so forth. And we filtered it down to create these interventions that Shivani is going to talk about next.
Thank you, Mel. Hello, everyone. So the rationale around first-time submission rates of Black and Asian students and the challenges faced by those students entering study from vocational backgrounds provided us with the opportunity and the need to transform the way we design and teach assessment at BCU. So as a result of this, we've been able to take a more authentic approach to assessment at course and module level, with more relevance and alignment to industry in some courses as well, which is great. If you go into the next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the activities we've incorporated as part of the assessment workstream is around staff development for improved assessment and feedback practices. So this has come in the form of a workshop package for staff around designing assessment, writing effective assessment tasks. And this has been supplemented with a standardized assessment brief template, which is to be disseminated across BCU, which aims to have accessible principles for all students. Additionally, we are providing training on anti-racist pedagogy to tackle those degree awarding gaps between Black, South Asian and white students. And in addition to this, we have also created an assessment brief checklist, which looks at those core principles of assessment and is designed to aid staff in designing accessible assessment for students. As part of this, we are also developing our students' assessment literacy skills. So through exercises such as translating marking criteria into more accessible language for our students, taking a more co-creative approach with our peer tutors, for example, in this way, and through the use of exemplars as well. And all of this is going to be translated onto our course level roadmaps, which is designed to be a map to promote transparency for our students so they can see the link between the module and the program. As well as this, we are introducing a new assessment platform called Cadmus, which aims to support students in accessing and submitting assignments as well. Okay, back to you, Mel.
Sorry, I was trying to answer a question. So the evaluative approach that we took, of course, working with TASO, we embedded evaluation at the beginning, and I'll talk about lessons learned in a little bit. So we were really well supported with understanding how the theory of change worked. I think one of the things that stood out to me was about how specific you have to be when you're going through this theory of change process. And it was a really great challenge for senior leaders across the institution to think particularly about how are we going to address the needs of Black and South Asian students in our interventions, and trying to find interventions that work for them based on what evidence we have, versus just creating large-scale interventions that may or may not just be good academic practice. So we looked at activities going across the pilots. So based on the data that I mentioned earlier, we identified core modules that we would work on that would have the biggest impact on our gap. So we phased out activity pilots in those core modules. And so we've already implemented elements of the assessment, the accessible principles of assessment, but there's more for us to do there. Early indications of the gap closing because of these interventions already and the targeted support. Also, the Cadmus platform that Shivrana just spoke about is about to be implemented, and has been implemented, sorry, and we're already seeing a slight increase in first-time submissions and an increase at grades at module level. So I would have identified earlier that we were seeing that Black and South Asian students were not submitting the first time, which meant that they were capped, which meant that the overall degree outcomes were automatically limited. And so Cadmus is already showing us an improvement there. And so we still have some more evaluation to do and some more data for us to dig into to actually better understand where we can problematize the gap surfacing with Black and South Asian students. But we're seeing some positive improvement already. And finally, on lessons learned, next slide. So we learned a lesson that, yes, sometimes we have interventions that and activities that aren't necessarily most effectively monitored. We also learned the lesson that sometimes we can't use the theory of change model in some of the things that we want to do for our students, and that's okay as well. It doesn't, everything that we want to do for our students, particularly the Black and South Asian students, don't have to be evaluated. But so we decided as an institution that we would take a dual approach and implement, yes, evaluative approaches to the awarding gap, but actually looking at whole institution change. And that's what Project Zero is at BCU. So it's early days, but we're embedding our evaluated activity into wider activity to celebrate, but also support Black and South Asian students, centering their voice, and hoping that we can actually listen to the students and do what they're asking us to do in a lot of cases. We're still developing the assessment package and designing that to make it something that's bespoke for across the university and different programs. And as I've mentioned, we are continuing to look at our data to see where further issues are surfacing with the gap, because certain assumptions can be made if you don't look properly at your data, and that's particularly the quantitative data. Also, developing internal expertise was a crucial part of this. We recognized that across the senior leadership team, there was a willingness and a want to address the awarding gap, but there was at times, and not just with the senior team, but there were at times a lot of trepidation about talking about things like racism, or being able to articulate what racism is and how it potentially impacts students. Deficit thinking and all of these things are training that we're doing and developing amongst our staff. Again, repeating that we understood the importance of evaluation from the outset. And even though I mentioned Project Zero isn't going to be using theory of change as an evaluative model, kind of the way that we have done it with this TASO project, we are still looking at evaluation from the beginning. How do we evaluate these activities? What are we trying to get out of it? And then designing the interventions around that. I mentioned that our project sponsor was our Pro-Vice Chancellor, and that was really important to ensure that cross-institutional leadership, but also that kind of sponsorship that we want to do this and it's a priority for the institution. And of course, our new Vice Chancellor has come in and made it very clear that that's a priority too. But fundamentally, we're just grateful for the opportunity to contribute to what the sector has been addressing as a wicked problem for a long time. And fundamentally, we really are happy to be able to support our Black and South Asian students because they deserve a quality education as well.
Thank you, Mel and Shivani. That's very clear lessons learned as well. We'll have time in the Q&A to return to this example, but as you can see, there's a lot of lessons learned. I am going to move on now to the next partner organization, which is the University of Law, and Dr. Morag Duffin, the head of Access and Student Success, will be presenting this.
Thank you, Emma. So yes, I'm Morag Duffin. I'm the head of Access and Student Success at the University of Law, and I'll be talking about our project, the Monitor of Inclusive Learning Panels that we use at the University of Law. So first of all, just to give you a bit of context about who we are, because we're a small specialist institution that you may not be aware of. We are a multi-location provider, so we have campuses across the country, and we also have some satellite campuses for our postgraduate courses based at other institutions, existing universities. We also have a large online program. We, as you guess by the name, majority of our courses are postgraduate professionally regulated law programs, but we do have a variety of other kind of related disciplines as well. And we have got the largest undergraduate law school in the country. And we were focusing on this project on our undergraduate LLB program. And that's the particular focus of the Monitor of Inclusive Learning panel work that we've used in this, used in the TASO project. So like BCU, we're also a approved Wave 1 APP provider, and similar to BCU, we have similar struggles with a range of awarding gaps across our undergraduate programs, which the vast majority of our LLB students, and that's not just within ethnicity, but also other widening participation characteristics as well. So our intervention that we looked at here is much more broadly designed to look at inclusivity of our curricula in general. Now, the final point I want to make about our context is very important to understanding our particular intervention. So at the University of Law, we have a centrally designed curriculum, which then our staff across our campuses will then deliver. So this means that we have one set of materials, and the design of those materials is so important for everyone to deliver consistently, but also that it's in a format that people who haven't created it can understand and deliver appropriately. So inclusivity is really important at that stage. And we use a specific model for that delivery, a kind of flipped learning approach, where we ask our students to prepare before they come to class. Then during the engage section is when we then deliver those materials, those centrally designed materials to the students, and then they follow up with consolidation in their own time. So that's a bit about us. Now onto our Monitor of Inclusive Learning panel. So this is an intervention that we've had at the university for a few years, where we have a panel of specialists across the university, from business professionals, academics, design specialists, and students, who will review regularly all of our programs, undergraduate, postgraduate, law, business, psychology, for inclusivity. And we'll come up with suggestions for improvement from this review. So reviewing things from examples of module materials, specimen assessments, student guidance, all sorts of things. And they will focus on 6 different areas to provide guidance to the design staff and the program teams around the representation in the modules, so representation of people, areas, things like that, the media used, flexibility of the modules, use of language in the modules, accessibility of content, and importantly, more opportunities for including diverse and inclusive content. So as I said, panels includes people from across the university, and the feedback from those panels is then taken to the program directors and incorporated into our annual design review and updating process, which predominantly exists to update things in relation to changes in the law, but we use this as an opportunity to really review the inclusivity of the materials that we are providing our staff to deliver. So then onto the project team. What was really important with our process here to develop the theory of change for this particular, I guess, scheme, this particular activity, was looking at those who would be involved in the one for the LLB. So we have our central widening participation team members of staff involved, me and our widening participation and evaluation officer, but then also those key individuals are LLB National Programme Director, the head of the LLB programmes, our Director of Design and Assessment, and I'm a member of our academic practice team, development team. So we had all of the people in the room who were the decision makers around changes to programme and changes to curricula. Not, however, the designers, because they are taken from our other teams. They are our academic staff who will be then allocated a module here to design there, a module here to design. And I think that will come clear when I talk a little bit about some of the change mechanisms that we discovered within our work for the theory of change. So our 4 key change mechanisms within our theory of change, and I think very, very key ones that we kind of were aware of, but I think through this process with the TASO project really came to light the importance of these ones within this area of work. One of which obviously being that our student needs are taken into account within the business as usual process, and making sure we have our students involved, not just in the panels and with review materials, but in how the feedback gets taken aboard by the programme teams, and how that results in change in the materials that are being shared. The second one, and I've noticed some comments already around about staff development and staff involvement, really was getting that trust and the buy-in from delivery staff. And that's where we had this very interesting model where we have centralized design, which is then being we have kind of the national program director say this is what we would like our design to look at. Then you've got somebody who's creating those materials, and then you've got a whole nother set of staff who are then delivering those materials. So ensuring that we had that buy-in across all of those different areas, because the program director could be very supportive about it, but then if the design staff doesn't really believe that, you know, we need to change these things here or do things differently there, then that's not going to happen. Or if the delivery staff then aren't delivering in the way that's been intended by the designer, then you've got another gap in there. So that was a huge change mechanism for us there, and linked to that one around the fact that those conversations need to be dialogical, so that people are aware of what needs to be done and will deliver that action and result in action in change in curricula. And then I think that final change mechanism links straight back to the first one about the importance of our diversification being responsive to our students' needs, so that it can engender that interest and engagement for our students. So then to move on to what we've learned, and I think for us, I think probably one of the most important things that we got from this was all just being sat in the same room talking about the intervention and understanding what the intervention was. And that really made a difference for us to be able to understand how we were going to evaluate it, to work out how many different individuals were involved, how they were involved, and how we could measure change or learning, whether that's from the staff side, the student side, looking at results, looking at engagement in the programs. And that links to the next point around stakeholder engagement. We first started with a kind of smaller team, but then when we'd developed it further, we had more colleagues from across the university being really actively involved and interested in the work that we were doing, which was absolutely crucial. An interesting point that we found out, and I think this is because this is an ongoing intervention, but we were having a new focus for this particular programme for the LLB, was the timing of when we did the intervention for that to work with the evaluation, making sure we had the Moyle panel take place before we have the design window to make changes to the design, and how we would fit that evaluation in between each of the steps of the process. And I think that leads to my final point, which I found really useful, was how theory of change obviously is ideally put in place at the beginning of a project, but the real benefits of doing it in the middle of a program to really make you stop and think and reflect. And that's what we had here. It was an existing intervention that we were going to apply to a certain program. So we already knew what we were doing, but hadn't thought about why we're doing what we're doing, what kind of impact we hope that each parts of that intervention will have. And the theory of change mapping process really helped us understand that in a lot more detail, and really helped, I think, the wide range of stakeholders understand the importance of what we were doing and their particular role and their empowerment within the role to do it. Yep, that's it from me. Thank you, and happy to answer questions later at the panel stage.
Thank you, Morag, and apologies that your colleague Rebecca Harland is not well today. But thank you for your presentation. And as Morag has said, we'll do Q&A at the end of all the presentations. So we now are moving on to the third and final partner organization, which is the University of Southampton Ethnicity Degree Awarding Gap Theory of Change, when we'll hear from Dr. Emma Thompson, Dr. Julia O'Connell, and Chido Chipato. I will wait for Emma, I think, to come on first.
Yeah, thanks, Omar. I actually wanted to preface our whole presentation with thanks to Omar for hosting today, and also more broadly to Tezo for everything that we've taken away from working with you through this project. Could I have the next couple of slides, please, Omar? Thank you, perfect. So what you're able to see there is a reflection of how our project is truly a multi-team effort, and one that I've recently written about in a blog hosted on Tezo's website. So at Southampton, we have a directorate that is focused towards our widening access and participation efforts, called Widening Participation and Social Mobility. And it pulls together a number of different elements. So we have the access team, which is the traditional schools and colleges outreach, supporting access to university, the enhancement team, which is my team, that supports both access and success initiatives with academic skills provision at its core. We then have the student success team who focus on student inclusion and financial support. And finally, our life cycle function, which ensures all of our partnerships and processes are joined up across the student life cycle. And as I'm sure you can imagine, as a team with a wide range of differential experience, but with a shared approach to tackling inequity at our institution, evaluating all of our efforts in a consistent and mutually beneficial way can be quite challenging. So we really wanted to work with Tezo to understand how we could best unite our efforts in an evaluative sense to address the gap that we have between UK domiciled full-time Black and white students, which is significant at our institution like it is at other places. So with this in mind, all of our efforts aligned across each of these different team areas and to our innovative 3Cs framework, which is what my colleague Chido is going to talk about.
Thank you, Emma. So our 3Cs framework began as a way of thematically analysing our awarding gap data and has now developed into a multi-dimensional approach to addressing our awarding gaps. And it's very much the foundational framework for our awarding gap project. So I'll quickly just go into the three Cs, a quick overview. So we kind of start with the culture element, which was very much concerned as it pertains to the project, to the university's overall ethos and its influence on the broader institution. Sorry, can I get the previous slide, please, still? And then we go into the curriculum strand, which is very much concerned with learning and teaching practices and brings into consideration activities which support students' academic success. So for example, academic skills and academic skills support, which is also forms part of our project here. And then finally, the community element, which is a core element to all the work we do, which considers nurturing our students' sense of belonging and their respective sense of belonging to not only their respective student groups, but also to the broader university community. Next slide. So the Awarding Gap project sits very much within the culture strand, and it was launched early in January 2022. So it's been going on for almost 2 to 3 years now, and it's very much one of our more developed projects in terms of approaching and addressing our awarding gaps here at Southampton. So it sits more on a macro level. So we work directly with Black students at the university in a co-collaborative way. We have and they form a student panel The students themselves curate peer-led community building activities, as well as hosting events and creating resources, student-facing resources for their peers, one of which being our Black Freshers Guide, which has been really useful for our new incoming and returning students each year, as well as also engaging with multiple stakeholders throughout the university themselves. So the students are very much in a position to consult, but also collaborate with colleagues throughout the institution. And this has formulated this has formed one of our main outputs in terms of our interventions as part of this co-collaborative project we evaluated with Tezo. And now I'll hand over to Julia, who will talk about the second part of our co-collaborative project.
Let's unmute myself. Thank you, Chido. And then another of our key initiatives was this dissertation retreat programme, which delivered a bespoke series of retreats for a targeted group of students at the university in their final year. So just to start by briefly explaining the format of retreats, what they usually do is they break up a writing day into smaller blocks of writing, which usually last about an hour. And at the beginning of each writing block, students are asked to set goals and discuss those goals with their peers. And then at the end of that writing block, they come together again and discuss their progress and how well they've done over that hour. One of the other things that's important to say is that regular breaks and communal meals are also a really important part of the retreat process, and they really allow students to get to know their peers, but also chat about their projects, discuss how they're doing, and also to articulate what they're doing with those dissertations as well. So the retreats were delivered by staff from the academic skills team at the university. So you had specialists in academic writing, study skills, and maths and statistics. And they comprised of 3 elements. So the first aspect of the project was the delivery of an on-campus retreat, where students discussed and focused on the development of their research skills and planned those dissertations. As part of this, we also developed a DIY retreat toolkit, which is hosted or will be hosted on our website. And that really provides guidance to students on how they can replicate the retreat in their own time with their friends, etc. And then finally, that culminated in the residential writing retreat, which took place over 3 days at Cumberland Lodge in Windsor Great Park. And students worked really hard over these 3 days, and they made significant progress on their dissertations. But it was also a really celebratory event for these students, and they got to know each other as a group, and they really felt a tangible sense of individual and collective achievement as well. So I'll pass back over to Emma.
Thanks, Julia. I love all our projects. I think they're absolutely brilliant. But we identified 3 kind of key change mechanisms. So both our Rewarding Gap project that Chido has talked about and the dissertation writing retreats, both of those things aim to contribute to an increased sense of community and belonging. Through the delivery of events and activities that are designed to amplify the Black student voice, and then also by providing a space that would allow for students to build really meaningful relationships with each other. So Julia talked about the need for space and proper breaks and things like that, and that was all feeding into that sense of community and belonging. The writing retreat aims to also improve the overall grade awarded for the dissertations by virtue of the fact that students who participate in the retreats will hopefully be more likely to complete their dissertations, which was something we're planning to test through our evaluation plan over the course of the next few months, or weeks actually, as the term comes to an end. But both of those both interim outcomes of these change mechanisms, we hope will ultimately contribute to improved overall grade at degree level. So bringing the increased sense of community and belonging together with that improved grade for the dissertation, which we hope is a gateway through to the longer term impact that we want to see. So on to our next slide, please, Omar.
I think it's me starting with the first quotation from the project, and the response to the retreats more generally has been really, really positive. I think all staff who attended really came away with a sense of like tangible excitement on the part of the students to progress with their dissertations, which was fantastic. This quotation here comes from one of the mature students who attended the retreats, and they were really juggling university work with their caring responsibilities. And the thing that really stuck out to us was the sense that they had been able to get that really protected time and space to make significant, tangible progress on their dissertation. And it really spoke to that intention that we had with our dissertations to provide that as well. And I also think this really, this quotation also draws out the real sense of accomplishment and pride in that commitment and hard work over the 3 days of the retreat.
Yes, I feel like all three of these quotes speak to the impact of the project. So the bottom two are from our Awarding Gap project panelists, and the middle one kind of refers to the feeling of having joined a super team. And I think that speaks to yeah, the impact that the project has had, not only on the students individually, but also that wider sense that they belong to a team that's making an impact and making a change within the institution. And I think the bottom one particularly speaks to the sense of development of not only community for students on an interpersonal level, but also on a wider scale within the university.
It's me again as well. There were a number of key learnings that we took away, and I think probably at this point in time, the quotes that you've seen from Julia and Chido probably cover some of that as we're looking towards some of our longer term evaluation as we sort of see outcomes for students. But we wanted to focus for our key learnings here on what we took away from the process, really, of working with TASO in this way. So I think for us, coming together to evaluate was so useful, because rather than just identifying the common aim of let's reduce the awarding gap, which we know we have to do, we really unpicked the commonalities in terms of outcomes, outputs and activities, as well as the overall and long-term impact. And we could only really do that by having those lengthy conversations that we had through the workshops. You know, we knew each other all really well. We were at a huge advantage there. We work operationally together exceptionally well. But I think we recognised that immersing ourselves within this evaluative time and space was hugely beneficial. And so we are also really excited about how we can use what we've learned from working with TASO, the methods that the evaluators use, and how we can apply that across some of our other projects coming together within the directorate, but also as a way of achieving buy-in across a large institution. So we hope that what we've learned will positively impact on our kind of consultancy approach to engaging with our faculties and encouraging more of even more of a whole provider approach to this type of work. We have the next slide, please, Omar, which I think is just the final one on further reading and planned publication. So as you can see there, there are a couple of blogs that are already on TASO's website. We'd recommend you have a read of those if you've got a few minutes. And then we also have another one coming from Julia, which will talk about the dissertation writing retreat in more detail. And then we'll have our kind of planned publications, which will be happening internally in the first instance. So other than that, we will wrap up. Thanks, Omar.
Thank you, Emma, Julia, and Chido. Yep. And so having heard from our three partner organizations who we developed the theory of changes with, we're also going to hand over now to the evaluator team from Staffordshire University and Advanced HE. They'll provide some further insights and recommendations with regard to theory of change and evaluation learning from the three projects that you've heard, as well as the three additional projects. I also want to flag that these insights and recommendations, and as well as some others, are included in a summary report that's been published today, which has some useful tips for developing a theory of change and evaluation plan in your own context. I will now, without further ado, hand over to Amanda, Sally, Kira, and Penny, who will present.
Thanks, Omar. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with a bit of a presentation setting the context. So some of the stuff that Omar said are probably going to be a bit repeated, but with some more information. So I'm Penny. I am a mixed methods researcher for Advanced HE, and I worked together with Amanda, Sally, and Kira in supporting these wonderful 6 institutions with their theory of change and evaluation planning. So next slide, please, Omar. What best than some key numbers to describe what actually happened on the ground? So brace yourselves. I'm going to talk for quite a bit on this first number, which is 5. The number of planned meetings and workshops we did with each one of the institutions. And this included a general introduction online meeting between the intervention leaders from each head and the 2 members from our delivery team who would be working with each one of them, just to familiarize each other with the intervention and try to finalize workshop dates as well as participants for those. Then we had an introduction online meeting bringing all HEPs together so that they could introduce their initiative to their peers, and also so that we as the delivery team could introduce ourselves and the project outline. The remaining 3 were the actual workshops we delivered, so those on theory of change and evaluation, which were tailored to the intervention of each institution and had each a dedicated slide deck with relevant content and co-creation activities planned to raise participants' awareness of key terminology, as well as to facilitate their hands-on engagement with practical application of how to develop theories of change and evaluation plans. The first one of those was devoted to core theory of change development and included Tezos templates, and I walk through this with each one of its containers, which we all call buckets, using a financial aid intervention as an example, before encouraging participants to engage in co-creation to further develop the core theory of change of their own intervention, while working in small groups and having a facilitated open discussion to refine content towards the end of that first theory of change workshop. The second theory of change workshop was devoted to enhanced theory of change development. And this included, again, familiarizing participants with the relevant Tezos templates, asking them to use the core theory of change they had produced in the first workshop to try and plan their intervention more thoroughly, working again in small groups, taking the sections of the enhanced theory of change template in turn, although admittedly, most time was spent on trying to identify those mechanisms of change that Morag presented and talked a bit before, and assumptions and how these are important. The final workshop was devoted to evaluation planning, but I will let Kira to talk more about that. Just to come back to the practicalities of this work and lessons learned, keep one key message if you could, and that would be the need to be agile and flexible to adopt the process to your needs and the level of planning of your intervention. Just as a testament to the degree of flexibility we adopted to work with each provider, all these workshops to different formats, including both face-to-face and online options, happened at different timings, ranging from back-to-back to those being scattered over weeks, and were even sometimes split into half sessions. Next number, please, Omar, is to showcase how collaborative theory of change and evaluation planning work is. And we engaged with 57 stakeholders across all meetings and institutions who held a variety of roles and had a variety of seniority levels, ranging from ABDCs all the way to students. Off to my next number, please, which is on my recurrent topic of time. 17 hours were spent from each HEP across all planned meetings. And this does not include the time spent on background work, like additional meetings and email trails to bring colleagues up to date, to resolve queries, to continue on that co-creation, any preparatory work required between each meeting, and of course, any time for reviewing drafts and finalizing outputs. My final three numbers are included to showcase that theory of change and evaluation are iterative processes requiring refinements and input from multiple people at different stages. So we produced 3 outputs per HEP, as Omar said at the beginning, but each one of those had approximately 3 draft versions before arriving in its final form, which means in total, our small but mighty delivery team, along with our lovely HEPs, produced 46 drafts before delivering the suite of the wonderful 18 finalized outputs that you will now find on TASO's website. Over to my next slide, please, Omar, which is to reiterate and visualize the fact that theory of change and evaluation development takes time and is a messy process, but definitely worth engaging with, as it results in great deliverables and concrete plans that can be followed through from start to end when trying to assess interventions and their contributions to reducing the ethnicity awarding gaps. So everything that you see on top of the timeline represents our great expectations before actually starting on delivering the program, whereas everything below showcases what actually happens when we hit the ground running. Each color-coded rectangle you see represents a different kind of activity involved in the delivery of the project. So as you see on our expected timeline, we thought that the delivery would be linear and sequential, with no stages overlapping, clearly divided into those workshops with its provider, then 2 to 3 follow-up meetings to finalize outputs and resolve any queries. And we thought that this would all be done between September and mid-December so that we could all have a lovely, carefree Christmas break. The reality was a bit different, as you can see at the bottom. The program started a bit later than anticipated, and trying to adapt to every institution's context, time capacity, and general resourcing meant that workshops, online meetings, and deliverable deadlines all had to overlap. As I mentioned before, outside of the formal workshops, we engaged with each provider further through multiple online meetings, email trails, and we had to go through at least 3 iterations of each output, remember, before everything was finalized. So our delivery spanned from end of September until end of January. So if you have experience of engaging with theory of change and evaluation and you overrun your estimated timings or your delivery plans, you are not alone. It happened to us too, but that's okay, because theory of change development and evaluation are not a race. They need time as they require co-creation and are living documents that will go through multiple iterations, benefiting from the input of various people at different stages. So don't get caught up into filling all the templates and doing everything all at once, but rather embrace the process and be patient. The results of engaging in this type of collaborative work are really worth it, even if they don't happen overnight. And I am sure that Amanda, Sally, and Kira will highlight this further in a bit. Over to Kira from me now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kira Bunting. I'll be chatting a little bit about our evaluation planning and evaluation process that we worked through with the 6 different HEPs as part of this process. As Penny has mentioned, some of the elements that we took forward in designing our workshops was using a coaching style approach to engage higher education providers in evaluation planning in a way that was accessible. So depending on where different higher education providers are at, and it's not just the 6 institutions we've worked with, this is across the sector, there's differing levels of evaluation capacity and evaluation literacy as well. So one of the things we really wanted to do, as Penny mentioned with the buckets, was kind of throw a little bit of the jargon out the window and work with people in a really clear-cut way to figure out what exactly they needed out of their intervention to understand they've met their goals. So one of the great things about theory of change in general is the fact that it not only helps designing of interventions to ensure that we're planning clearly and hitting our intended goals, but the evaluation is embedded into the process as well. So it's always evaluation ready when you're working through a TASO theory of change, which is a really beneficial thing. You'll see 3 of the key questions here that we had as part of our day 2 workshop. Depending on where institutions were at, we did meet them where they were. So some were ready to kind of explore the evaluation work in that day 2, where other ones we kind of took a more ad hoc approach and met them through a range of sessions and emails and meetings, as was mentioned earlier. So really taking that agile approach to ensure that we could meet providers where they were at and make this the most effective process for them. In some cases, this meant that we took a little bit more of an advisory or consultancy role, but that was more in the methodology specific sections of the evaluation planning as well. When it was coming to the big picture thinking and really thinking, what is it that we want to find out here? What impact did we have? That was a really co-created process and something that was really valuable to have our intervention leads and our evaluators from the higher education providers being part of that conversation directly. You can see 3 of the coaching style questions we had up here. What data do you need in the short term? What do you need to know in the long term? And do you have any of this data already? It was really just trying to kick off the evaluation questions and conversations with institutions in a way that was readily approachable. Next slide, please. One of the great things about the TASO documentation as well is that it really did allow us to work towards preparing for evaluation implementation. Working through the enhanced theory of change, which if you look at the resources that TASO has already published today, you can have a really good understanding of the different levels between a core theory of change and an enhanced theory of change, and how much finer detail that really brings into it. By looking back at our e-talks and working with the higher education providers, we were able to tailor different research methodologies and different evaluation plans to best address their needs and their institutional kind of interventions. So again, this meant we tailored it to each provider based on their capacity and the resource. So for example, some universities, and this again isn't just our HEPS or our higher education providers, we have little acronyms now, don't we, within acronyms, but not only the higher education providers we worked with, but across the sector, we do know that there's differing levels of resource and capacity to engage with evaluative work. This is something that is being requested more by our regulators in the Office for Students, so it's something that's really valuable for individuals that are in this meeting to engage with further and learn more about. And we think that by piloting the evaluation template as well, we were able to work with TASO and the higher education providers to develop an evaluative template and kind of project planning template that really hits the nail on the head of what's needed to be able to effectively implement an evaluation for your interventions. That's all from me. So I'm going to hand on over now and I'll say next slide. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So as you can see, we went on quite the journey together, our little project team as we were. And we had to learn how to work together quickly, and we had to learn how to work together quickly with the individual higher education providers, or so-called HEPs. So we thought actually that learning process that we went through in the whole journey would be really helpful to share with the sector. So here are some insights and recommendations from us on that regard. You could go to the next slide, please, Emily. So, but as with any kind of project, the main sort of challenge that you initially kind of encounter is that getting started. And as you can see, we've started to develop our own little language, calling things HEPs, calling enhanced theories of change e-talks, core theories of change c-talks. And this was something that kind of came naturally at working with one another, but there were a few things that were particularly helpful. So having a shared language that we developed from the TASO templates, but also from the previous research that was mentioned earlier on typologies coded from the access and participation plans, that gave us a really quick way of getting to know one another and making sure that we were all on the same page. So TASO shared the applications to participate in the project from the individual higher education providers with us. And in those applications, they described their interventions in terms of the typologies. And that gave us a very good idea of what they were trying to achieve and whom with. So that was our initial get to know one another.
Sorry, Amanda, I do have slight difficulty hearing you. I don't know if it's your reception. Maybe could you lean forward a little bit and we'll see how it goes. Apologies.
Is that improved?
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just having that shared language helped us get started really quickly. But then also using the TESO template, particularly the core theory of change template. I think we started the first full day session with the presentation on what that template is and what each of the components are. And so we defined what's an output, what's an outcome, what the difference between the two, what's an activity. And that gave everybody the common ground to then continue their conversations in the rest of the session. So it really was a benefit of actually just having a place to start using those templates. Then keeping the conversation moving, as Penny already mentioned, we created these buckets, which in actuality were just giant pieces of paper that we had written outputs at the top and outcomes at the top. But we had that there, and these buckets were a place for you to get your thoughts down while you had them, and you weren't hung up on, you know, is that actually an output or is that actually an outcome as much, because you knew you could go back to it. The important thing was getting everybody to record those important conversations that they were having then and there, and then you could come back to it to make it into a logic model. And because everybody's very passionate about this, it did mean sometimes that the conversation kept moving a little too well. So we had some critical questions that would draw people back into what we were focusing on. And those critical questions would be things like, how does this activity lead to this outcome? Or will that really happen as a result of your intervention? Or will this happen for all students or just for some? So there was a few questions that just helped kind of like keep us grounded in the task at hand. One of the other first challenges that we encountered was knowing who to include. And so across the 6 different higher education providers, we worked with quite a few different configurations of teams. So different mixes of roles, different target beneficiaries of the programs and interventions. So we actually got a good breadth of information of like what actually is essential. And we found that the diverse representation in terms of roles and backgrounds. So in terms of roles, you had your key players, you had students, senior stakeholders, evaluators, strategic planners, and operational staff, so the staff delivering the intervention. And you needed those perspectives to be involved in a group conversation when developing the core theory of change, to be able to play off of one another's experiences and knowledge and kind of bring that all together into a really high-level overview of what your intervention and activities are aiming to achieve. Then you also had the need for a diverse representation in terms of backgrounds. And by that, I mean, people who are meant to be benefiting from the intervention need to be included in the conversation. So if it's students, such as the case with the most ethnicity degree awarding gap initiatives, you need to have students in there with lived experience to be able to test the logic that you are saying, okay, if we produce this activity, then this outcome should happen. And then from that outcome, we should have that impact. So those are two sort of aspects that were really, really important. Making the best use of time, as you've gotten all these key players together and involved in the project, we found that there was a bit of a pattern in the different types of delivery that we did across higher education providers. We really found that actually face-to-face engagement and a full day session for the core theory of change kept that motivation up. Everybody was really energized by being able to talk about this and have the space to talk about something that they were passionate about with other people who are also passionate. So that was really happy. That was really helpful to see everybody kind of getting together in that group sense. But then when we were developing the enhanced theory of change and the evaluation plans, we found that actually the online and bite-sized chunks, because different parts needed input from different people, really was a good way of kind of getting that level of detail that you needed. And as with anything,
I'm really sorry, Amanda, but we can't hear you that well, and I've got some comments in the chat about it. So
I honestly, I don't know.
I know, I'm sorry about this. I think we might have to just move on to the next slide into Sally, because it doesn't seem to be improving. And apologies, but I've just seen in the chat a few other people making the comment. Apologies. But thank you. I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Just to pick up on the last slide there, I think one of the most important things to remember from this is that these are live documents. So as we're building up the theory of change plans and the evaluation plans, they're not fixed documents. We found that we were going backwards and forwards between them. We were going between the core theory of change, between the enhanced theory of change and the evaluation plans. And you will likely do so as you progress through the intervention, as the intervention develops itself as well. So moving on from that, the last thing that we wanted to talk about, one of the things that we were reflecting on, was the fact that pretty much everyone we imagine is here because you're interested in evaluation planning or in theory of change, developing interventions to address the ethnicity degree awarding gap. So if you're going to be developing these theory of change models, if you're going to be developing evaluation plans anyway, how can you make them as effective as possible for your own use? So one of the things that we reflected on quite a lot was, as you're approaching these processes, think about what you actually want to get from them and plan accordingly. So as Omar said at the beginning, you might have only just started about thinking about addressing the ethnicity degree awarding gap and you haven't yet developed an intervention, or you might have already done that. You might be like Morag and the Moyle project and be several years into it and be thinking about developing an impact evaluation. Or you might be somewhere in the middle, and kind of where you are at in that process will likely depend on how you approach this process as well. So we found that the TASER templates were really good for providing a framework for our thinking around whichever stage we were at, and doing that in a very flexible and agile approach for each individual provider. And so the theory of changes, we found that you can use differently for specific use cases. So the core theory of change is really good for having a bird's eye overview of perhaps an institutional approach to addressing the ethnicity degree awarding gap, incorporating all of the different interventions that you might be doing and all of the different outcomes, perhaps to communicate to stakeholders and to other people, professional services, academic colleagues, about what an institution's approach to the EDAG is. It's really good for getting down everything that you're doing for set interventions and for understanding the resource costs and requirements in a whole access and participation cycle. It's quite good because it only needs that top level detail, and so it's a lot quicker to produce than an enhanced theory of change. One of the detriments of the core theory of change, though, is that it doesn't help anyone to understand the granularity of the detail for what successful implementation or evaluation might look like. So if interventions aren't fully thought through, it can lead to designing interventions that have less chance of being effective for our students. And that's ultimately what this whole process is for. It's for addressing inequalities for our students, which ultimately is a waste of resource, depending on what your focus is. So this is where the enhanced theory of change comes in. And as colleagues have said throughout this webinar so far, this takes a lot longer than a core theory of change, but it's really good for digging into the granularity of an intervention or activity. And as Morag was saying, one of the things that they found was that it was so beneficial being sat in a room at the same time, understanding what the intervention was. And we found that this was very much the case for the enhanced theory of change, that as you were digging into what an intervention actually is, what are the assumptions behind this, why do we think this is going to work, that was very much what that process was beneficial for. So it was more of a process for that one. It's also good for having an organisational memory of what an intervention is for, what it's meant to be doing, how it's meant to be working, and for communicating that. It does require input from a lot of different people to understand the intricacies and the dependencies. And so it might not be something that is possible to do for everything, but we definitely see the purpose for that. And then for evaluation planning, the type of evaluation that you do, again, as Omar alluded to at the beginning, will very much depend on where you're at with your intervention. If you're right at the beginning, you might be thinking more about doing a pilot evaluation or an IPE. If you're kind of further through your intervention, you've kind of honed it down, you know what it's looking like, and you're kind of liking what it's looking like, you might be looking to do more of an impact evaluation or a cost benefit evaluation. So we also reflected on the fact that these buckets, the different elements of a talk, you can focus on to various extents. So in the templates that TASO have, there's lots of different questions that focus your attention on these different buckets. But you might want to focus on different elements depending on what you're interested in doing. And so the inputs might be particularly important to get really granular, get really accurate if what you're interested in is doing a cost benefit type evaluation, if you're interested in looking at social return on investment. Or perhaps if you're at the beginning of this process, if you need to secure resource commitment from senior executive teams, if you really need to outline exactly what the inputs are going to be, what the cost is going to be, then it makes sense to spend more time on those inputs. The activities and the assumptions are really important to get that granularity, to understand what is required for implementation, for successful implementation. If this intervention is going to work, what does this have to look like? The outputs are really important for if you're interested in knowing whether an intervention has been conducted as it needs to be conducted, as you see it should be conducted. And then, of course, the outcomes and the change mechanisms are really beneficial for your impact evaluations, for understanding how this intervention is meant to work. So is it really going to work the way that we think it's going to work? Why? What are the change mechanisms? What's the theory behind it? And that's really beneficial as well for communicating and getting buy-in from whoever you're working with, whether that's senior stakeholders, whether that's people who are delivering this, whether it's from people that you want to help sponsor or recruit to the intervention, to help understand why this intervention, why should we care, and why should we care about how it's implemented. And then finally, the last thing that we found really useful is, as Kira's talked before about bridging between the enhanced theory of change and the evaluation plan. What you'll find once you've done an enhanced theory of change is that you have loads of different outcomes, loads of different change mechanisms by which you think this intervention will impact on those inequalities. What we'd recommend is to kind of pick and choose perhaps a couple of those different outcomes that you think are most likely to be most impacted, and focus on those rather than trying to get everything all down at once. I think our experience is that ends up in quite an unwieldy and messy evaluation plan. So think about what you particularly want to find, what you particularly want to find out about whether your intervention is working. So that is everything from us about our reflections so far. We're happy to chat more about this to anyone.
Great. Thank you, Sally, and apologies, Amanda, and to the participants about your microphone. We were able to hear it, but just wasn't clear. But we have now 15 minutes for Q&A. We've got some questions already in the chat, so I thought I'd just start with them. I mean, we've got I think we've got one person from each team, Emma, Morag, and Shivani respectively, and Sally and Amanda from the evaluation team to answer these questions. So I thought I'd start with the first one from Iman Khan, which is question about decolonizing as an approach to view why the gap exists to begin with, and a concern that there is not an approach to structural issues like white supremacy in higher education, and is decolonizing as a lens being used in any of the interventions. I believe some of the curriculum interventions did focus on decolonizing, but I was curious if there were any of the participants or if the evaluator had any response to that.
I'll go. That's a really great question. I think it's important to draw a distinction between what we have to return to the Office for Students based on the theory of change, which is a statistical model that requires us to address statistics. So the data that comes out of our institutions pertaining to the awarding gap shows that there's a gap in the degree awarding outcomes of Black students versus white students, or South Asian students in the context of BCU versus white students. So we have to return a statistically based, evidence-based approach to the Office for Students using the theory of change model. That in and of itself, in my opinion anyway, is a completely different ballpark to decolonizing, which is why when we presented, we talked about Project Zero, which is that wider institution approach that may not necessarily be able to use the standard approaches to evaluation that are acceptable by the Office for Students, for example, But those of us who understand decolonising know that we should not be subject to those types of evaluation methods, because those types of evaluation methods themselves could potentially be harmful, could potentially influence deficit thinking, and ultimately research methods, as we know when we look at decolonising research methods, don't necessarily agree with this approach to evaluating student outcomes, student success, the whole model of education. So in our view, returning to the Office for Students based on our statistical data around Black and white students, or South Asian and white students, is something that we have to do as a university, but it's not necessarily the only thing that we're doing to address the needs of Black and South Asian students. I also say I've noticed the use of the term deficit in a couple of the other questions, and it's important again for us to understand the context within which we're using these words. It's not a deficit approach if you're creating interventions to support students where data, yes, but also the students are saying that they need that support. So by designing these interventions for the students that may not necessarily work for the Office of Students, but work for the students, in my view, that's not deficit thinking, that's actually co-creation, and that's looking at options, looking at opportunities to provide support for students in an equitable way. But you are right, the approach that sometimes is taken based on the statistics can lend itself to deficit thinking. And that's why those of us in leadership, or not in leadership, anyone actually in the institution, should be very careful with the narrative that comes out around ethnicity degree awarding gaps, but also work around decolonising Black and South Asian students and so on and so forth. So in my views, in summary, I think that they can overlap in some ways, but in large part, decolonising and deficit thinking can actually be in a completely different ballpark to what we have to do as a university to return to the Office for Students.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. I'd just add that we have done previous work looking at curriculum form, including a decolonizing intervention that you can find on our website. I do want to get to some of the other questions, but I also obviously also agree that addressing inequalities is not about viewing the groups that experience the inequalities as having deficits, but I can understand and appreciate that sometimes that is the way in which it can feel in terms of how it's communicated and addressed. We do have two specific questions around, for the Southampton team, I believe, around the writing retreats. So there's one around how did you build interest in the writing retreats and communicate the availability, and then just a little bit more around those writing retreats, like who attended and what they looked like. So I don't know who from the Southampton team can answer that.
That'll be me, and I'll come back as well to that other question if I may, after I've addressed this one. So we do want to make clear that as the enhanced theory of change does, as it's published on TASO's website, the retreats weren't just offered only to Black heritage students, but we did want to have an intervention that was offered widely to the students. So, you know, we really wanted to build on personal relationships. So I suppose answering some of that question is that this work isn't taken in isolation. It's or shouldn't be taken in isolation. The project that we did was something that we wanted to come together to evaluate in a really, really coherent way, but it's part of much wider efforts that I think are not coming from a deficit or agent-focused approach. And so, yeah, I think what we wanted to emphasize was that our work was part of wider efforts to build relationships with students, to empower them, to support us in creating the change that we want to see. And so our approach to recruiting was based on some of those relationships. So the first thing that we did was looking at those students who we know perhaps are saying that they would want that they would benefit from it. So in particular, students who have worked with us with our inclusion team, so those students got priority access. We then sent an expression of interest form based on data that we had about students from a number of different widening access and participation groups, and then sort of at the next level we then honed this down to looking at those who were on course for sort of 2-2-2-1 boundary, and selected students on that basis, and we were working with quite small numbers. We had for our residential, we had 20 places for students, and they were quite quickly taken up with the approach that we took.
Okay, there are some questions that have been answered already, but as ever, we definitely used some acronyms that not everyone may be familiar with. So IPE is Implementation and Process Evaluation. There's some questions around the theory of change templates themselves, and the e-talks that were enhanced theory of change, yet another acronym. They are available on our website, so please do look at that. Another question that's come through that is one that I think all of the projects, so be welcome anyone on this one, is the involvement of students. So how important or were students involved in your co-creation approach? So that's kind of, I suppose, for everyone, you know, how do we involve students? When do we involve students in theory of change development specifically, or in a co-creation approach?
I'll go.
Go ahead, Emma.
Truthfully speaking, universities, I can speak on the whole, don't involve students enough in these types of high-level decisions. We do have to find the balance between bringing students into spaces that they can't converse in, because a lot of the stuff that we're doing behind the scenes with theory of change, Office for Students and all that kind of stuff, you'd have to be working in the sector for years to even remotely understand it. But also creating spaces that are safe for students, but also opportunities for them to actually meaningfully contribute. So at BCU, we involve students as much as possible from the very beginning of designing interventions. We involve them in actually creating the resources and the documentations and the templates. And I mentioned about Project Zero, we're actually, as an institution, cross-institutionally now, taking a proactive approach to engage students across the board consistently in anything to do with the ethnicity degree awarding gap. We're giving them the opportunity to feed through, develop resources. We're paying them for their time or offering them rewards and giving them a choice if they want to participate, because we don't expect them to just give to us and not give anything back. And we're also looking at having students who are on placements or on longer term engagement with the institution, as well as past students engaging with the project. So in terms of co-creation, we are really ramping up how we really effectively engage with our students from the very beginning.
And I think, thank you, Melanie. Yes, and I think Morag, you'd also like to come in on this.
Yeah, so like Melanie, we use students a lot, and we have paid student advocates who will work with us on a lot of our projects, in particular the Monitor of Inclusive Learning panel. We have students who sit on the panel. I think for us is really the area of work that we need to do is we will use them as a central learning participation team, or the program teams at a high level might use them, but how can we encourage staff at all levels to engage with students within their work? So we find that when we then, so our program leads will be really keen to get student feedback, but then you'll need a designer who has the time and the space to be able to engage with the student, to get them actively involved in design. Some places we've had huge successes with that, where we had students actively helping design some of our modules, but you need that engagement and you need that buy-in for staff to be able to facilitate that student engagement as well.
Yeah, there's a real, obviously all of our partners want to respond. So Emma, I want to come to you too. Obviously it's a key question and one that applies to all higher education institutions. Emma?
Yeah, I think we're probably in a similar position to the other institutions. We have an awarding gap panel where students are paid as part of that, and we work with them on a long-term basis. We also have our student advisory board as well, which is a similar model. And so, you know, we look to provide opportunities for students to, you know, contribute to that, a lot of the stuff around cost of living and things like that through this work.
Great. Sally, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, go on then. So I think there's something with student voice in particular, and kind of how we engage students, and I think this and kind of as Mel and others have kind of alluded to, it is. We don't do a very good job of involving students in higher education. And I think that one of the challenges is that at the moment there's this narrative that we should involve students and we should harness the student voice, but we don't necessarily think about why we want the student voice. And so I think that one of the things about thinking about when to involve students should be a consideration of why we want to involve students in the first place, and involve them meaningfully at those times. One of the things that we got from the last project with TASO was that students don't trust higher educators because of all the tokenism that they experience, especially marginalised ethnicity students. And so if we do ask for the student voice, and it's a tick box approach because we're doing it because we should be getting the student voice, then they're not going to come back to us again later. So in answer to the question of when should we involve students and when should we get the student voice in developing these things, it all depends on what you want to get out of that interaction and that relationship.
Really important and rich conversation on involving students, and I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I just want to flag that two further people who presented today, Penny and Kira, also flagging that the Loughborough theory of change, which is on the website, did explicitly include students practically in theory of change workshops and development. We don't have time for much more, but there was one more question. It also flowed from I think Melanie's first response, which is how do we overall access and participation strategies versus individual interventions fit into this process? And I suppose it's a wider point too, that it's a good thing in some ways that the access and participation plans are driving providers to focus more on evaluation, but obviously there are other things that higher education institutions are doing to engage in students and to tackle inequality. So I don't know if anybody wanted to talk about the sort of link between the actions and the individual interventions they're doing and how that links into their overall APP strategies which of course are required by all universities and which are something that senior leadership is quite focused on as well. Does anyone want to?
I could jump in. I love doing that. I can jump in with, so I mentioned Project Zero. So myself and our head of EDI have been asked by the Vice Chancellor to create a project that allows us, and so this is what we're doing. We are looking at key moments along the students' learning journey from before they transition in, their transitioning, assessment, personal tutoring, all along the students' journey to the point where they leave university. And we're asking experts across the institution, so the people who lead on areas of service or learning and teaching leads, to look at those key areas all at the same time. So it's a massive piece of work. And at the same time, we'll be hosting focus groups and conversations with students so that they get to have their say as well. And we'll be compiling a big insight project alongside data and evidence from our evaluation team to understand how Black and South Asian students perceive these interventions, how they perceive these experiences, and what are some of the things that they think will work or things that aren't working. Alongside that, the experts will be providing their insights into it, because from my experience and knowledge of BCU, we've never done something like this. So colleagues haven't necessarily been enabled to look at their area, particularly through the lens of what are the needs of Black and South Asian students. And so I think that's great, to be honest. I personally think that's great. And so we're doing that across those core areas of the learning journey. We'll provide a massive piece of insight, and then the university will say, okay, hopefully we're going to resource this and make these changes. It's going to be kind of like what you have with continuous monitoring and evaluation of a course, but we're doing it for the whole university. And the idea is it will continue to be something that we use to evaluate the university from the perspective of the needs of Black and South Asian students and staff, because they're a fundamental part of this as well. And that is kind of sitting on top of the APP.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I'm just realizing the time, and obviously we've already asked the well over 100 participants on this call to join us for an hour and a half today, and I'm really grateful for all of them. So I'm going to have to do my thank yous and concluding remarks, and apologies that not everyone got a chance to answer all the questions. We'll try in our communication and follow up to answer any further questions. I do also want to remind you to look out for both the evaluation form of what you thought of this event, and also to look out for our annual conference and register for that if you're interested in May. I do want to thank again all of the presenters today for taking the time to engage in these really critical questions. As we've all outlined, this is a long-standing and persistent inequality, the ethnicity degree awarding gap between white and Black students and between South Asian and white students across all providers. It's critical that we're not just committed to doing this work, but that we're doing this work effectively, that we're demonstrating it not just for our access and participation plans, but for the students on campus who are not currently having the same outcomes. So I think you've seen today the kind of approach that a range of providers are doing. Hopefully that will be useful and interesting to you too. And hopefully the kinds of templates, the kinds of learning that you've heard today from our excellent partner organizations and our evaluator will inspire you, but also ultimately lead to us tackling this longstanding racial inequality in higher education. And with that, it just leaves me to say thank you to everyone again. goodbye, and please continue to engage with our work and the work of the wider section in addressing inequality. Thank you.